Welcome to InFocus with Ejaz Haider. This program comes to you from the Center for Security, Strategy and Policy Research. What about CESPA? It's an autonomous policy research center housed in the University of Lahore, and it tackles issues that impact contemporary security and strategic developments. This program is part of that effort. Today, as in the last episode, I will discuss the ongoing bloodletting in Gaza. We are recording this episode on the 13th day of this war, so the statistics, what an unfortunate term when we're talking about human loss of life, but we have to obviously, for want of a better word, so the statistics reflect that on the basis of what is known. On the Israeli side, 1,403 people have been killed. This includes 305 active duty soldiers, and 3,800 are reported wounded. While Israel says these are civilians, Hamas argues that many of them include armed settlers and Israeli military reservists. For the information of viewers in this part of the world, Israel keeps a standing army of about 170,000, but has a large number of reservists who go back to their civilian jobs after their compulsive military service, but can be recalled during an emergency. And this military service is compulsory for the majority of Israelis. There are certain exemptions. And this is when they turn 18, and the men have to serve for 32 months and women serve for 24 months. On the Palestinian side, 3,478 civilians, and these are certified civilians, have been killed. The number includes over 1,000 children of various ages. In the occupied West Bank, which is not ruled by Hamas, but is under the nominal authority of Palestinian Authority, 69 civilians have been killed so far. The number of wounded as Gaza and occupied West Bank stands at over 12,000 and 1,300 respectively. A strike at an Anglican hospital in Gaza on day 12 of the war killed nearly 400 people, mostly children. While Hamas says they died in an Israeli airstrike, Israel refutes that claim and says they died because of a malfunctioning Islamic Jihad rocket. The claims and counterclaims can only, if at all, be judged on the basis of an independent inquiry, which, given the situation, is unlikely. In today's developments, as I said, we're recording it on the 13th day of this unfortunate war. An Israeli air raid in southern Gaza near Rafah killed at least 30 people and injured another 21. Israel also hit Hezbollah positions in southern Lebanon early today. At least 2 people were reported injured. At least 5 Palestinians were killed in Israeli raids in the occupied West Bank. Palestinian security forces in Ramallah fired tear gas and stun grenades at protesters who were throwing rocks and chanting against President Mahmoud Abbas. An estimated 300 protesters from the human rights organization Jewish Voice for Peace, calling for a ceasefire, were arrested after they occupied one of the blocks in the United States Capitol complex. This was yesterday, on Wednesday. Israeli forces stormed at least 2 cities in the occupied bank, arresting suspected Hamas members. Now, Israel has amassed tanks, APCs, self-propelled and field artillery around North Gaza, and has indicated that it will start a ground invasion with support from the air and sea. That invasion hasn't begun yet, but the airstrikes continue, flattening buildings in Gaza. Israel has also bombed points in southern Gaza, even though it had earlier asked North Gazans to move to the southern part of the strip. Attempts so far for a humanitarian pause have failed. There are also fears of an expanded conflict if Hezbollah gets into the fray. Where's the situation headed and why has it got to where it has? I have with me Daniel Levy. Mr. Levy is the president of the U.S. Middle East Peace Project, an organization based in London and New York. It's focused on advancing a mutually dignified and acceptable resolution of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. He was a senior advisor to the Israeli Prime Minister's office and to Justice Minister Yossi Beilin during the Ehud Barak government. In addition, Mr. Levy was an Israeli official for the Israel-Palestine talks at Taba under Prime Minister Barak and at Oslo B under Itzhak Rabin, as well as being a lead drafter of the Moral Peace Agreement, which is also called the Geneva Initiative. Daniel, thank you so much for being with me. I know it's a very busy time, and everyone is busy for very unfortunate reasons. But before we get to where the situation is, I want to, in order to take a slightly sort of longer trajectory of the issue, I want to ask you, because you were in the middle of the peace process also, how has the Israeli society changed from then to now? And I'm asking you this because even at that time, we saw the unfortunate assassination of Prime Minister Rabin. We also saw that Mr. Netanyahu, who has been the Prime Minister of Israel now for almost 15 years, barring this previous year and a half. And in 1995, he led a mock funeral procession, which featured a coffin and a hangman's noose. And this was an anti-Rabin rally where protesters were chanting "Death to Rabin." And, the report suggests that the chief of internal security, Kami Gilon, had even alerted Netanyahu of a plot on Rabin's life and had actually asked him to moderate his rhetoric, which he did not. So there were elements then too. But has something changed in terms of now a dominance of the religious Zionists in the security forces and also in the political spectrum?
Well, Ejaz, first, let me say it's a pleasure to be with you. And it's not a pleasure because the times are horrible, but it's at least as an interviewee, good to be able to address a question which is framed as if history didn't begin on October the 7th of this year.
Correct.
So thank you for taking us there. I think a few things have gone on, but I think that trajectory that you describe of Israeli society today and how do we wrap our heads around that? And I think when Oslo started 30 years ago, the local dynamics were different. And there's been a trajectory that Palestinian society has gone on. And we can touch on that. The local politics is different and the geopolitics are different. And maybe we'll come to that. But let me stick with your question. One thing which I think is obvious to many people and not unusual or exclusive to the Israeli-Palestinian dynamic is a failed peace process is a very dangerous thing. You build up a hope, and that part of Israeli society that thought, yes, we'll get on board with this. There's an opportunity here, I think is in a different place today. Now, what you need to add to that analysis is how did we get here? And I think crucial to that is the basic premise of Oslo was that the Palestinians had accepted a state on just 22% of historic Palestine, West Bank, Gaza, East Jerusalem, that would deal with the 1967 occupation and issues, but would largely park, if not ignore, the 1948 issue of the Nakba, the catastrophe, the Palestinian expulsion. When you look at the scenes today, people may say, wow, how come there are so many people in this tiny area called Gaza? Why are so many of them refugees? You need to understand the history of 47 to 49 to get there. But the Palestinians, the PLO, says yes to negotiations, yes to the mini state, if we can call it that. What needed to happen to make good on that outcome, imperfect as it was that the international guarantors had to make sure that the more powerful party, because there is a power asymmetry here, occupying state, occupied people, that the more powerful party would live up to its commitments. And if one looks at the litany of failures over the last 30 years, a very special place in that cabinet of failures has to be accorded to the external guarantor, because Israel quadrupled its settlements, entrenched its occupation, made the Palestinians who did that deal look not credible with their own public, therefore empowered a more militant wing, as we saw on the weekend. That's America as almost the monopolistic actor on this issue. And what this said to Israelis was, maybe you thought you had to deal with the Palestinians, even if it was difficult, even if the Palestinians did things that were very hard for you. But the learned lesson of Israelis is actually you don't. Actually, you can get away with anything you like. You can relegate the Palestinian issue to an afterthought. You can keep the Palestinians without rights, and the world will treat you with impunity rather than hold you accountable. And there's lots of things that have gone on in Israeli society. Radicalization, the growth of the national settler religious Zionist faction, the fact that the ultra-Orthodox, who actually didn't have strong positions, have become almost part of that hard right settler movement. Until we've gotten to a place where the most radical actors, the folks who are carrying signs with Rabin dressed up in a Nazi uniform in the 90s, in the lead up to the assassination, these guys are sitting in the cabinet today. One of them is the Minister of Police handing out weapons to volunteer forces in Israel, which is incredibly dangerous and incendiary. So that shift in Israeli society is important. And the last thing I'd say on this is the cohort of Israelis who got behind the peace process, again, imperfect as it was, they still exist. But they have been carried away also with this idea that we can just manage the Palestinians. And they haven't rediscovered their voice. And they didn't rediscover that voice in the so-called democracy protest movement either. Right.
So here's the thing. That's a great sort of, summing up of where the situation is. Of course, books have been written on this. But the transformation of geopolitics, one remembers the time when during the Suez crisis, the US president told Mr. Ben-Gurion that he has to withdraw the forces. And Mr. Ben-Gurion said, my cabinet will not accept this. And he said, well, your cabinet is your problem. From then to what we see now, there's a huge difference geopolitically, and of course, the difference in the kind of heft and clout that Israel has managed over the years. But with hindsight, would you agree? And it's interesting that just 10 days ago, after this whole thing started, I pulled out from my references that article that Edward Said had written opposing the Oslo process, which was published by the London Review of Books. With hindsight, would you agree with what he was fearing? And he was, of course, not just holding Israel responsible, he was also holding the PLO responsible for a number of strategic mistakes that they had made. How would you, a rereading of that article? And I actually thought that because many years ago, I actually wrote something which opposed what Said was saying. But when I reread it this time, I thought that he was, we all know he was extremely incisive, that what he was fearing was spot on.
Well, first of all, you've set me my reading for this evening. So thank you, Ejaz. I'm going to go back and read that myself because I know the article, of course, but it might be the timely time to revisit it. It's a very important piece of this, that what happened around Oslo was that initially, people remember there was the first Gulf War, and America puts together a coalition to remove Iraq from Kuwait that included Arab countries. Yeah. This is under the first Bush presidency. And part of the way that plays out is that America then convenes in Madrid with Russia, more as a gesture than anything else, a peace conference. The Palestinian party to that peace conference, over Israeli objections that it must not be the PLO, were local leaders. Now, the fascinating thing is those local leaders coming from what was then an occupation that was close to a quarter of a century. Now it's more than half a century of occupation. Those local leaders were probably better negotiators because they better understood the situation than what then came into the mix in the secret Oslo channel, which was the exiled PLO leadership. And now you needed the national movement. But did the national movement understand what it was getting itself into? There have just been a host of kind of what went wrong pieces looking back over 30 years, because the 30-year anniversary of Oslo was last month. And someone I used to work with surprised me in an interview by saying that the biggest mistake was the Palestinian leadership believed the Israelis in terms of what, and he was one of them. Now, I think that the importance of that is that the PLO eventually takes on the ownership of this interim self-governing authority of the Palestinian Authority in 1995. In Oslo, that has a 5-year time horizon before resolving all the issues for a deal. And I talk about the importance of it because I think where we are now is we are in, if I can use Gramscian terms, we are in this morbid interregnum. Oslo is dead. A Palestinian Authority that cooperates with Israel in security but offers nothing to its own people is a rotten corpse of a body. But it's still there, and it hasn't been replaced by something, and it needs to be replaced by something. And one of the great weaknesses is that you have a Palestinian leadership that on October 6th, the day before this, was divided, was not able to really offer a strategy. And I'm not blaming the victim here. I'm just acknowledging that the contributory factors include the body that represents the Palestinians couldn't offer a strategic challenge to Israel on the international arena. And then you mentioned 56, Suez. You have 1974, after the 73 October War, Henry Ford calls for a reassessment of the relationship with Israel, then president of the US. That paves the way to the Camp David Agreement. And in 91, the Americans actually, under Bush and Baker, questioned some of the assistance that Israel receives from America, which again, I think, was part of what led to Oslo. So you've also got this slippage in the American position from understanding that we're America, we have a national interest, and it includes resolving this and sometimes getting in Israel's face to do so, versus the position today where it almost becomes an appendage to domestic politics. And I think something that is of great cost to America in this fluid geopolitical climate in which we live, because I think much of the world looks at this, including the latest American veto at the UN Security Council on this matter, looks at this and says, yeah, we knew you held this to a different standard. We knew you were selective, and now we're seeing proof of it again.
Now, one of the things that Israel has been doing is it's been doing for a long time, and it's unfortunate because people like us who have, excellent Jewish friends. One of my mentors, the late Professor Cohen, was like a father figure for me. And we consider this, to be very honest, we consider this not only perfidious, but a travesty to brand criticism of Israel's policies as anti-Semitic. Now, I consider this, of course, as part of the power narrative. There's a reason behind this. But this has also, in a way, given Israel a free pass, not just in the United States, but also in large parts of Europe. Now, those of you, yourself, I've been reading Gideon Levy for a long time. I was editing a newspaper 20 years ago, and I met the late Yuri Evneri at a conference, and I asked him that, I would like to pick up his articles from, at the Gush Shalom, and a number of other, B'Tselem, and all, a number of very sensitive, empathetic, discerning Israeli and Jewish voices have been talking about what has been happening to Palestine. How much traction do these voices now have in the Israeli society? It kind of links up with the first question that I had put you.
Of course, these are people that I'm familiar with. And, it's very important that when we take into account, as we must, the power asymmetry, the root causes, the fact of Palestinian dispossession and denial of rights over such a long period, that in that context, we don't slip into dehumanizing Israelis. Because at the end of the day, there will have to be an arrangement which realizes the rights of Israelis under whatever the new dispensation is. That doesn't come at the expense of Palestinians. It has to be predicated, unlike history, on equality. Now, there is also a disturbing phenomenon in the West, especially in a kind of populist, xenophobic Europe and United States of white nationalism, that has brought to the fore anti-Semitism again. It's brought to the fore horrendous Islamophobia as well. Let me be very clear about that. However, the attempt in recent years to redefine anti-Semitism and to try and create a definition, including legislating a definition for it to be binding, that replaces what I understand and what we have historically understood anti-Semitism to consist of, with the idea that criticizing Israel and its policies is the new anti-Semitism, as it's called. I think this has had a pernicious effect. It has led people to take their eye off the ball of the real threat of anti-Semitism. It has divided communities. It has made a broad struggle against racism in Western societies where Black, Muslim, Jewish communities can be part of that. It has made that incredibly difficult. Now, I'm not saying that there aren't elements of opposition to Israel which include anti-Semitism, but the real thrust there has and what it has done is it's been used as a cover for Israel's policies.
I perfectly, yeah, but I think you made a very interesting point that it actually takes the issue away from actual anti-Semitism. I mean, I remember I chuckled when this so-called war on terror began, and there was like a sort of collusion between the elements of the Israeli lobby in the United States and the Christian evangelists who talk about the second coming of Christ, which, if you ask me, is the biggest indication of anti-Semitism, in religious historical terms. And so it was so deeply ironic at that point. But let me ask you, and you talked about the fact that the sort of agreement went back to 67. No, it never went back to 48, the Nakba, and 22% of the territory. And we then have had this consistent settler problem. Now, for instance, you have two ministers in Mr. Netanyahu's cabinet, one finance minister, the other the national security minister, both of whom are illegal settlers. And in the case of Itamar Ben-Gvir, he was indicted for hate speech. He used to have a portrait of Baruch Goldstein, who massacred the Palestinian, in his drawing room. So we now have those elements in positions of power where they can exercise effective leverage and can make or break governments in Knesset. So it seems to me that the domestic politics is also now playing a very pernicious kind of influence on how Israel can deal with in a justiciable manner with the Palestinian issue.
Well, absolutely. To close our previous exchange, and also as we bring this conversation to a close, I think there's this phenomenon of anti-Semites for Israel, because that's the only way to understand some of the dispensationalist evangelical support. However, when it comes to this very disturbing phenomenon of not only do you have the regular policies of deepening occupation, but you also now have in these very important positions around the cabinet table people who are committed, and we can't make light of this, so we have to say it as it is, people who are committed to a second Nakba, a second mass forced displacement, ethnic cleansing of Palestinians. That's being talked about right now. The language being used prior to October 7th, that was their plan. They're open about their plans. And the language that has intensified in the last days is this call for a Nakba. And I fear that if we do see an attempt to push Palestinians out of Gaza into Egypt, that actually that's not where the focus of those plans are. It's a test case for whether you can push Palestinians out of the West Bank, even out of Israel proper, into Jordan. And I'm not being a fantasist. This is what Israeli senior figures talk about, and we have quite disturbing news as to some of the things that are under consideration. This is a dehumanization taken to terrifying levels, and there is a climate of fear also amongst the Palestinian citizens of Israel. Of course, there is fear amongst Jewish Israelis too. Now, how did we get here, and what do we do about it? I think a key part of how we got here is the permissive environment created by impunity. People haven't pushed back against that. Even today, as Western leaders are visiting Israel to stand in solidarity, and I'm good with them feeling the pain and empathizing, but you cannot do that without empathizing and demonstrating that you take seriously the equal humanity of Palestinian life and Palestinian pain. Because if you buy into a narrative which says whatever Israel does, cut food, fuel, water, electricity, humanitarian supplies, bomb indiscriminately almost. If all of that can just be laid at Hamas's door, no, that's not what's going on. Hamas has not cut the food, fuel, water, electricity. Hamas is not the one bombing now. It's Israeli bombs. You cannot give Israel a free pass on international law, on international humanitarian law, on being held to that same standard, because you are encouraging the worst tendencies. And this is the kind of policies that led to having these guys who you refer to, Ben Gvir and Smotrich, in the government in the first place. And Israelis are human beings. If they see in reality that people tell them, no, we can't get away with doing this to the Palestinians, but actually they can, and their lived experience is that they can, then what you have is a descent further and further into the abyss, and we need to pull back from that. And I want to be honest, if America and its allies and Israel's allies are not capable of stepping into the breach, then we have a world today where global South powers, I think, they can't steal this file away from America, and they probably don't want to, but they have more of a say. And I'm looking to whether it was the Brazilians who showed some leadership at the Security Council before the American veto, whether it's others who gathered at the organization of the Islamic Conference meeting in Jeddah just very recently, if it's the Global South members of the G20, if it's your own country, I think we need to see initiatives, and we need to wrestle the monopolistic oversight of this issue from the hands of those who have conspicuously failed to deal with it effectively.
Daniel, I know you have to leave, but one final question quickly, because you talked about this whole thing of pushing the Palestinians out of the West Bank also, and now there seems to be a very clear policy with respect to Gaza to sort of push them into the Sinai, and Egypt obviously is resisting that. Where is this headed? Because the global South, and global South is now we're using it as a single term. It's so many countries. They're not really in a position right now to be effective. And we have seen what the US and its allies have to say about this. Where do you think this unfortunate situation is headed towards, especially if Hezbollah also hots up the northern border?
Yeah. First of all, if we don't contain this, then it will spill over inside the Palestinian arena. I've spoken about West Bank, East Jerusalem, inside Israel itself. But it will spread further afield. And I think there is the Americans are saying, just make sure it doesn't spread. Lebanon border, Hezbollah, broader regional conflagration. But there is a correlation between how bad things will get on the Palestinian front and in Gaza and the likelihood of that happening. So actually, if you don't want the regional escalation, you better do better than you have done so far in de-escalating it and getting a cessation of hostilities and getting a locked-in ceasefire and then dealing with the root causes when it comes to the Palestinian side of things. And I don't want to be Pollyannish about the role that others can play. We could call it the global majority. Global South is a phrase that is imperfect. But I do think that when it comes to the US role, I think it will help encouraging those voices inside the administration who want to lean in more and encouraging a rethink to a degree inside the administration. If they are hearing from those who they have been courting in the last year, in Indonesia, for instance, it's not planning to join the BRICS. It's a country that came out with a plan on Ukraine, cares about this issue. I'm just using that as an example of.
Yeah, I understand.
It can't be a priority for these countries, but they can bring their voice and their weight to bear. Because where we're going with this is somewhere that I think is extremely ill-advised for Israel and for its security, but that could be truly calamitous for the lives of millions of Palestinians, and we already see what's happening in Gaza. So, it's about stepping back from the brink, and it may need more than just America to do that from experience.
Thank you, Daniel. There's so much more that one could discuss, but I'm really grateful for your insights. And let's hope that, when we have an occasion next to talk about something, we would be talking about something, better in terms of how the security of both the peoples can be dealt with on an equal footing. Thank you.
I really enjoyed our conversation, so thank you very much.
Before I end this episode, I find it important to say a few things about narratives. We spoke about narratives with Daniel Levy. Narratives are used to mobilize and connect one's own tribe and to divide, isolate, demonize, and dehumanize the other. They are both the form and expression of power. In that sense, narratives seek to legitimate existing power relationship and make them seem natural. It's kind of routinization of it, almost becoming banal at one level. In situations where the power relationship is extremely one-sided, for example, Palestine since 1948 or 1967, if you want to take that as the benchmark, the narrative not only demeans an entire people, but perpetrates and perpetuates its own non-kinetic violence, often leading to actual physical violence. Now, Israeli physical violence against the Palestinians, not just in Gaza, but also in the occupied West Bank, has been extensively and intensively documented by the United Nations rights bodies. This includes B'Tselem. I spoke about this Israeli non-profit organization when I was speaking with Daniel, and other reporters and scholars. These observers include sensitive, discerning Jewish voices, and these are the people who are dismissed by Zionists as self-hating Jews. The current narrative adopted by the Western media has to be seen in this light. Since the regular, slow killing of Palestinians, and it's structural violence, the demolitions of their homes and the routinization of settler violence against them barely makes it to the Western broadcast media, and particularly local TV channels in the US, the Western media's outrage at Palestinian resistance is in line with the current asymmetry of power that we were talking about with Daniel. Israel is trying to designate Hamas as subhuman. That's what Netanyahu said. We're dealing with human animals, unworthy of protection under the normal laws of war. In other words, because Israel is a democracy, or claims to be a democracy, even though it's a Jewish state, And part of the civilized world, the Hamas attack must be decried and condemned for violating the laws of war. Hamas, on the other hand, being animals in human form, must be hounded and killed as animals. Any action against Hamas can be retributive and remain, if necessary, outside the canons of law. Ditto for the charge of terrorism. Hamas is a terrorist organization. Hamas has been equated now increasingly, especially after this episode, with ISIS. The term is supposed to evoke a response, a negative one, for anyone who's branded such. But its placement in the language is more than that. It is about setting a context and wielding power. Robin Lakoff, who's a linguistics professor, and she wrote the book, The Language War. And I quote from her work, it's an excerpt from her work. She notes this and says, making meaning is a defining activity of Homo sapiens. It is more than just a cognitive exercise, since those who get to superimpose a meaning on events control the future of their society. And since so much of our cognitive capacity is achieved via language, control of language, the determination of what words mean, who can use what form of language to what effects, in which settings, is power. Hence, the struggles I'm discussing in that book are not tussles over mere words or just semantics. They are battles. There's much more can be said about Israel's kinetic and non-kinetic violence against the hapless Palestinians, but the central point is simple, especially when we cut through the clutter. Remove the occupation and you eliminate violence from Palestine. Keep trying to eliminate the Palestinians and you remain mired in cycles of violence and misery. On that note, this is all from this episode. If you like the discussion, click on the subscribe button. That helps us bring you quality discussions. Until our next episode, goodbye and stay safe.